Imagine an entire country running out of money. Not a person, not a company, a whole nation. Its currency is collapsing, its banks are failing, and it can no longer pay for the food, fuel, and medicine it buys from abroad. When that happens, there is one number to call, one institution sitting in a gray building in Washington that can wire in billions of dollars almost overnight to stop the fall. It has rescued dozens of countries from the brink of ruin, and it has been blamed for pushing others straight into it. It can force a government to slash its budget, sell off its industries, and rewrite its laws, all as the price of a loan. To some, it is the fire brigade of the global economy. To others, it is a debt collector for the rich world. This is the International Monetary Fund, and this is how it actually works. To understand the IMF, you have to understand the disaster it was built to prevent. In the 1930s, the world economy tore itself apart. As the Great Depression spread, country after country tried to save itself at everyone else's expense, slapping up trade barriers and racing to devalue their own currencies to make their exports cheaper. Each move triggered another in return. Trade collapsed, the crisis deepened, and that economic chaos helped light the fuse for the Second World War. So in July of 1944, with that war still raging, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a financial system that would never let it happen again. Out of that meeting came two institutions, twin sisters of the global economy. One was the World Bank, the other was the International Monetary Fund, a permanent club of nations, each paying in, so that no member need ever again face financial collapse completely alone. So what exactly does the fund do? At its heart, the IMF has one core job. It is the world's lender of last resort. Think of it as the emergency room for national economies. Countries buy things from each other, oil, grain, machinery, medicine, and they pay in foreign currency, mostly US dollars. But sometimes a country runs critically short of that foreign money. Its exports collapse, or investors panic and yank their cash out overnight. This is called a balance of payments crisis, and left untreated, it is lethal. The currency crashes, imports stop, and the economy can seize up entirely. When no bank and no other government will lend to a country in that state, the IMF steps in. It provides emergency loans in hard currency to keep the lights on, keep imports flowing, and buy the government time to fix the underlying problem. It is, quite literally, the financial firefighter, the one you call when the whole house is already burning. But where does the money come from? This is where the IMF gets clever and controversial. Almost every country on Earth is a member, 191 of them. And when you join, you must pay in a kind of subscription called your quota. Your quota is based roughly on the size of your economy. Big, rich countries pay in a great deal. Small, poor ones pay in a little. That pool of quota money, drawn from nearly the entire planet, is the war chest the fund lends out. But the quota is not just a membership fee. It is the single most important number attached to any country in the IMF, because it decides three things at once. It sets how much you pay in. It sets the maximum you are normally allowed to borrow in a crisis. And, most importantly of all, it determines how much power you have. Because at the IMF, unlike at the United Nations, not every country gets an equal vote. At the United Nations General Assembly, every nation gets one vote. Tiny and giant, equal. The IMF works nothing like that. Here, your voting power is tied to your quota, to how much money you put in. The more you contribute, the more votes you command. And that hands enormous control to a handful of wealthy nations. The United States alone holds around 16.5% of all the votes, by far the largest share of any country. That might not sound like a majority, but here is the crucial detail. The biggest decisions at the IMF, changing its fundamental rules or how the quotas themselves are set, require an 85% supermajority to pass. Do the math. With just over 15%, any decision can be blocked. And the United States, sitting on more than 16%, is the only single country on Earth that holds that power. It has, in effect, a permanent veto. By long-standing tradition, the World Bank is always led by an American, and the IMF always by a European. For an institution that governs the whole planet's finances, the people who truly run it come from a very small part of it. The IMF also does something almost magical. It has created its own kind of money. It is not cash you can spend in a shop. It is called the Special Drawing Right, the SDR, and it is essentially an international reserve asset conjured into being by the fund itself. Its value isn't tied to any single national currency. Instead, an SDR is defined by a basket of the world's most important currencies: the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, and the British pound, blended together in fixed proportions. When the IMF wants to boost the world's reserves, as it did dramatically during the COVID pandemic, issuing the largest allocation in history, it can create new SDRs and hand them out to member countries in proportion to their quotas. A member can then swap its SDRs with another country for hard, usable currency. It is one of the closest things that exists to a genuine global currency, quietly underpinning the reserves of nations all around the world. Now we reach the most contentious part of the whole story, what the IMF asks for in return. Because the fund almost never simply hands over the money. Its loans come with strings, a long list of conditions the borrowing country must agree to, known as conditionality. The logic is straightforward. A country in crisis usually got there partly through its own bad decisions, and the IMF wants to fix the root cause and make sure it gets repaid, so it demands reforms. Historically, that meant a fairly standard prescription, sometimes called the Washington Consensus: cut government spending and balance the budget. Austerity: devalue the currency, raise interest rates, sell off state-owned industries. Privatization: throw open the borders to foreign trade and investment. Sign here, do all of this, and the money is yours, released in careful installments as you hit each target. Refuse, and the lifeline is pulled away. It is this deal, rescue in exchange for control, that has made the IMF one of the most powerful and most resented institutions in the world. Because those conditions fall on real people. When a government is ordered to slash its budget in the middle of a crisis, what often gets cut are the very things ordinary citizens depend on: food and fuel subsidies, public sector wages, healthcare, schools. Critics argue that this austerity can turn a downturn into a catastrophe, deepening the very recession it was meant to cure and hitting the poorest hardest of all. Over the decades, IMF riots have erupted across the globe as populations revolted against the price hikes and cuts that came attached to its loans. In the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, many accused the fund of making the panic worse. In Argentina's historic collapse, and later in Greece's debt agony, the IMF's medicine was blamed for prolonging the pain. The deepest criticism is this: that a group of economists in Washington cannot possibly understand every economy on Earth, yet applies a similar harsh formula to all of them. trading a nation's economic sovereignty for a check. The fund replies that it is the lender of last resort for a reason. By the time a country reaches its door, there are no painless options left, only less painful ones. People constantly confuse the IMF with its Bretton Woods twin, the World Bank. They sit across the street from one another in Washington and both lend money to countries. But their jobs are completely different. The simplest way to remember it is this: the IMF is the emergency room. It deals with short-term crises, stabilizing a currency, stopping a financial collapse, keeping a government solvent through the storm. The World Bank is the long-term development project. It funds things you can point at: roads, dams, power grids, schools, and clean water systems to help poorer countries grow richer over decades. One is the firefighter, rushing in to stop the blaze. The other is the architect, helping rebuild and expand the house for the future. Together, they are the two great pillars of the global financial order that emerged from that single hotel in New Hampshire 80 years ago. Today, the International Monetary Fund stands at the center of the world economy, with nearly every nation as a member, a lending capacity running into the trillions, and a Bulgarian economist, Kristalina Georgieva, as its managing director. In a world of pandemics, spiraling government debt, and financial shocks that leap across borders in seconds, the fire brigade is busier than ever. And it faces a hard question about its own future. Rising powers like China argue that the voting shares, still dominated by the West, no longer reflect who actually drives the global economy, and they are pushing to reform how the fund is run. So the IMF remains a paradox. It is a genuine safety net that has pulled dozens of nations back from the abyss, and at the same time, an institution accused of dictating terms to the desperate and answering mainly to the powerful. Firefighter or debt collector, rescuer or ruler. It is, either way, one of the most powerful institutions the world has ever built. And when the next country's economy catches fire, it will still be the one they call